Hey everyone, before we get into today's video, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about our sponsor, DraftKings Casino. Looking for an easy way to have some fun without having to leave your house? Enter DraftKings Casino, a completely online casino platform with over 300 real money games. I'm partnering with DraftKings on this video to let you guys know about an awesome deal that they have going on right now. All new customers who sign up using promo code Mr. Creeps and make a minimum $5 deposit will get that deposit matched dollar for dollar up to $2,000 in casino bonus funds. You heard right. DraftKings is matching all new customer deposits dollar for dollar up to $2,000 in casino bonus funds when they sign up and use promo code Mr. Creeps. DraftKings is safe, secure, and reliable, so you can always deposit and withdraw your money at your convenience. To get started, download the DraftKings app and sign up using promo code Mr. Creeps. I'll link everything below in the description. Enjoy. I started spending time at the necropolis when my wife had left me. I had thought that we were doing fine. The passion of our younger days had burned itself out, but wasn't that what happened in all marriages? And then, in a short, one-sided conversation, I learned that she couldn't be with me anymore. That she was frustrated and angry and felt at times like she was suffocating. She told me this in the morning, and by early evening, she was gone. Over the days that followed, the house that we had shared felt cold and empty, and I started to spend more time away from it. I sat in cafes, nursing a coffee for hours. I paced the streets and I discovered the necropolis. It was on the eastern outskirts of my home city, not an area that I had ever had a reason to go to before. As I stood there that first time, looking around at the thousands of burial places, I thought sadly how this city of the dead was a relic, abandoned long ago to fall into disarray. The headstones of the graves that lay all around me were darkened and worn with age. Some were broken and lay in pieces on the ground with weeds growing all around. I spent hours wandering in between them, looking at the inscriptions on the headstones that were still legible. The earliest that I saw was from 1836, and the most recent was dated in 1925, almost a century ago. After this, I headed up to higher ground, where there were dozens of mausoleums framed against the gray sky. It was clear they were testaments to the power and wealth of those who were buried in them. The men who had made their fortunes from textiles and imported goods. Men who needed the world to know how important they were long after the flesh had rotted from their bones inside of their stone tombs. It was fascinating, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I went home and slept better than I had in a long while. Over the days that followed, I returned to the necropolis and continued my exploration of it. There was one building near what looked to have been the main entrance to the necropolis that stood out as different. It was constructed from stone, but it was not a tomb. There was no grandiose inscription carved into it for a start. It looked to me more like somewhere that somebody would have lived. Perhaps someone who had worked at the necropolis, I wondered. A guard or a gravedigger or a janitor. Something along those lines. I walked a few times around the building. The windows and its only door were boarded up, but time and the weather had left these barricades worse for wear. I probably shouldn't be doing this, I thought. And then I put my hands into a gap in the boards along one of these side doors and pulled. A loud cracking sound made me freeze. I was alone in the necropolis as far as I knew, but I glanced around nervously anyway. Reassured that there were no witnesses to me breaking into the building, I gave the wood another hard pull. It gave. There was now enough of a gap for me to squeeze through. I breathed in to make sure, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and there was a damp, musty smell. Enough daylight trickled in through cracks in the wood over the windows for me to see. There were the remains of a wooden bed frame, a desk, and a chair. There was also a fireplace. Using the torch of my mobile phone, I tried to look up the chimney, but all I could see were spiders' webs. I turned my attention to the desk. There was a drawer in one side. It was very stiff, but after a bit of rattling, it moved and I slid it open. I was intrigued to see there was a leather-bound journal inside. It looked old and fragile, so I took it out very carefully and opened it as gently as I could. The handwritten pages inside were faded but still legible. My pulse racing, I began to read. My apprenticeship to the groundskeeper at the necropolis on Chambers Hill began on a summer's day in the year of 1899. I reported to him at the gatehouse at 7 o'clock in the morning, feeling excited and nervous in equal measure. Having only known schoolwork before, I had no idea what to expect. Things, I must admit, did not start well. The groundskeeper looked me up and down with an expression of utter disdain on his face. I had washed and combed my hair carefully and put on my smartest clothes, so I had no idea why he was so unhappy with me. And then he said in a gravelly voice, "You are an idiot. You'll be covered in dirt before the day is out, and your fancy shirt and trousers will be ruined." My heart sank and I said, "I'll run and go get changed." He shook his head. "There's no time for that, boy. The business of the dead won't wait." And with that, he turned and strode off. I scampered after him, my cheeks burning with embarrassment. I had been brought up in the countryside by my uncle after my parents had died when I was very young, and he had found this job for me in a cramped room in a boarding house. But he was growing old and had told me that he could do no more for me. I was on my own from now on, and I needed to make a success of the apprenticeship. The groundskeeper was moving at pace in between the headstones which lay all around us. The inscriptions on them blurred as I hurried to keep up. I did not mean to, but I kept standing on these strips of land where the body themselves must have laid. I said sorry each time that I did, as it felt wrong to trample on the resting place. Suddenly, the groundskeeper halted and span around. I stumbled and stopped inches from his sneering face. His breath stank and I could see the broken veins on his nose. He tapped me sharply on the top of the head with his knuckle and asked, "Is there something wrong inside here?" "No," I managed to reply. His sneer grew wider. "Then who are you talking to?" "The dead gentlemen and ladies, sir, for walking on their graves." I told him and braced myself for another stinging tap on my head. But to my surprise, he laughed. He laughed and he grabbed his sides and he rocked back and forwards as he did. And then he sighed and shook his head and looked me in the eye. And there was not a trace of amusement in his gaze when he said, "You can dance the jig on them if you want, boy. They're dead and nothing but a bunch of bones and food for the worms." And then he turned away and started up at an even faster pace than before. I was left confused and sickened. In a few months, a new century would begin, a new age, and yet, here I was in this strange place with this cold and cruel man as my master. But I was young and alone in the world. What could I do? Apart from follow him and not think about what lay below my clumsy feet. We were heading towards the highest ground where the grandest of tombs stood, when I heard a bell ringing. It was a small and quiet sound in the vast space of the necropolis, but there was no mistaking it. I was puzzled enough by it to ask the groundskeeper who was ringing a bell. He shrugged his shoulders in reply and said, "It is nature laughing at the foolishness of man." And then he pointed at a small headstone, and I realized the sound of the ringing bell was coming from under the ground next to it, from somewhere inside the grave. The shock on my face must have been clear, because the groundskeeper snorted and said, "The man whose grave this is had a fear of being buried alive, and left instructions that he be buried with a bell. Then, if he awoke in his coffin, he would ring it and help would come." "But it is ringing," I began to say, a vision of the terrified man lying in the dark below us, frantically appealing for help filling my mind. The groundskeeper cut me off. "I saw him in the chapel before the coffin lid was closed, in his cheap clothes, with his worthless bell placed on his chest. Then he was brought here and buried. That was 14 days ago and the fellow's dead. There's no question about it. And the only things that can be rattled in that bell today are the rats who had chewed their way into the coffin and are about to enjoy a feast of flesh." He shrugged again and strode away. I stood there feeling dizzy and lost as the bell sounded its lonely toll. And then it fell silent, which felt worse. The rat which was toying with it must have dropped it and moved on to the corpse. I started to feel hot, and then my stomach cramped and I leaned forwards and vomited. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of barked instructions about what my duties were to be, and the many ways that my meager wage would be docked when I did things wrong. I was shown how to dig a grave and left to scramble my own way out of the hole when it was finished, and I had dragged a barrel with the dirt that I had dug, up and down the hill for no good reason that I could see, and then I was told to fill the grave back in. More exhausting and frustrating tasks had followed, and it was not until I had been there for more than 12 hours that the groundskeeper finally told me to get out of his sight. I staggered back to the boarding house, fell into the small, hard bed in my gloomy room, and passed into a deep and dark sleep. I did not remember any dreams, but when I woke, the first thing I thought was that my life had become a nightmare. I had been so tired that I had slept in my smart clothes. They were now wrinkled and dirty. I looked down at them inside and couldn't see the point of changing them. I had to go to a washing the soil from my hands and face and hair, but soon I gave up and trudged out of the boarding house. The summer weather was lingering and there was not a cloud in the sky. It was going to be a beautiful day, everywhere else but not at the necropolis, I thought bitterly. The groundskeeper was standing outside of the gatehouse. He was putting tobacco into a clay pipe and, without looking up from this task, he said, "You're 5 minutes late. Your pay will be docked accordingly." I knew already that there was no point arguing, and I stood there brooding as the groundskeeper handed me a shovel and told me to get a move on. I trailed after him up the hill, where he pointed out where I was to dig a new grave. I took out my frustration on the ground, and in a short space of time, the grave was ready. The groundskeeper had not lifted a finger to help me, and I waited for him to give me the next torturous task. But instead, he told me to go sit by a nearby mausoleum and be quiet. Puzzled, I did what I was told and was glad of the chance to rest. I was soaked in sweat and aching all over, and I could have happily fallen asleep. And I was starting to nod off when I heard singing in the distance, I blinked and rubbed my face. The groundskeeper was also paying attention. He was looking down the hill. I followed his gaze and saw there was a small procession heading towards us. Sunlight glinted off a coffin carried on a horse-drawn carriage, behind which walked a dozen or so finely dressed men and women. Some of the party carried delicate-looking parasols, others held top hats. All were very smartly dressed, and it was they who were singing. As they came closer, I recognized that it was a hymn. I hadn't spotted him at first, but there was also a clergyman with the funeral procession, who approached the groundskeeper and thanked him for preparing the grave. He accepted the thanks with a small bow. I, having done all the hard work, watched on and bit my lip as the carriage drew level with the new grave, and the coffin was lowered into place. The ceremony that followed was brief but heartfelt, and ended with the finely dressed men and women, each gently throwing a rose onto the coffin before the procession had left, leaving just me and the groundskeeper standing by the grave. "Fill it in," he told me gruffly, and then left me laboring alone again. Once the coffin was covered with soil, I wiped fresh sweat from my brow and then swayed on my feet, suddenly feeling dizzy from the heat and my exertions. But there was to be no more rest for me just yet. The groundskeeper hurried me back down to the gatehouse, where the headstone for the new grave waited, and he made me carry it on my own and install it. More jobs followed, and by the time that I was due to finish, I was ready to drop where I stood. I started to leave, but the groundskeeper had stopped me. "You're going nowhere yet," he said. "Go wait by the new grave while I eat my dinner." Close to tears, I dragged myself back up to that accursed hill and I sat by the grave. I didn't think that it was possible to be more miserable than I was as the sun set on the day. Night had settled across the necropolis when the groundskeeper had walked up to me. He held a small lantern, though it was unlit. "Dig," he growled at me and pointed at the new grave. I looked at him horrified. He raised a hand threateningly into the air. "Dig," he said again, "or else I'll crack your skull open." Shivering from head to toe with fear, I began to remove the soil. It was not long before the lid of the coffin with its scattering of roses was exposed. The groundskeeper lit the lantern and handed it to me. "Keep it low," he muttered. "I don't want it to be seen." And then he clambered down into the grave and cracked open the lid of the coffin. The sound was sickening and sharp in the still night. And then the groundskeeper slid open the lid of the coffin, revealing the dead man within. By the flickering light of the lantern, I could see his pale skin, his closed eyes and lips. He was dressed in a formal and very smart three-piece suit. The gold chain of a pocket watch was draped across his waistcoat. The groundskeeper reached into the dead man's pocket and removed the watch and its chain. And then he went through the rest of the dead man's pockets and took out a silver cigarette case. He also slipped a ring off of his finger. He put all of these in his own pockets, slid the coffin lid back into place, and climbed back out of the grave. This robbery was the most appalling thing that I had ever seen, and I stared open-mouthed at the groundskeeper. He showed no sign of shame and looked me straight in the eye. "You breathe a word of this to anyone," he said. Then he drew a finger across the front of his neck, leaving me in no doubt what my fate would be if I spoke about the abhorrent crime that I had witnessed. When I finally had returned to the boarding house after filling the grave back in, I did not sleep at all. I hated the fact that I was too scared to do anything about the groundskeeper's desecration. I hated myself. And then the morning came and I returned to the necropolis. There was a bustle of activity already taking place when I had arrived. Stone blocks were being carried in on carriages accompanied by 3 workmen and a finely dressed gentleman. The groundskeeper skulked in the open doorway of the gatehouse and watched me with hooded eyes as I approached. "You remember my words of last night, boy," he said, too quietly for anybody to hear but me. I nodded. "Good," he went on. "Then go and help these men. They are constructing a new mausoleum and it will be a fine thing indeed. I will be staying in here. I have my own work to do." As he spoke, I caught the foul smell of alcohol on his breath, and I assumed that he would be spending the rest of his day drinking strong liquor and avoiding any kind of work. This did turn out to be a good thing, because it meant that I didn't have to see him while I assisted the workmen, and the gentleman who I learned had designed the mausoleum and was there to supervise its construction. He was happy to show me his plans and talk to me about Roman influences and the stone which had been brought hundreds of miles for this project. By the end of the day, I was tired but happier. There was, though, a cloud over my happiness, and a few days later the mausoleum was complete, and a man had been laid to rest there. As I watched the funeral party making their way out of the necropolis, I was left feeling sick with anticipation. And once more, as I had feared, the groundskeeper ordered me to stay behind as darkness fell, and then made me accompany him to the mausoleum. He broke open the door with a crowbar, but did so in a way that left minimal sign of any damage. It was clear to me that he was a practiced thief, and I wondered how many of the tombs and graves around us had he broken into like this. Thankfully, he did not force me to follow him inside of the mausoleum. When he had emerged long minutes later, carrying a walking cane with a silver hand grip, a pair of shoes that looked to be made out of the finest leather, and another pocket watch, a fresh wave of repulsion passed through me. He handed me the lantern, told me not to be late in the morning, or else he would have used the new cane on me, and he laughed. And then he strode off towards the gatehouse. I stood there feeling helpless. The dead needed someone to protect them, but I did not have the strength. With this weight on my shoulders, I set off walking down the hill. I had not gone far when I heard a sound that sent a chill through me. It was the bell. It was ringing once more from within the grave. I took a deep breath and went to fetch a shovel that lay nearby. I couldn't stop the thefts, but I could stop the bell from ringing by removing it. This would at least give a little dignity to the poor man who had been buried with it. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I put the lantern by the headstone to light my way, and I set about digging. The bell had fallen silent again by this time, so the only sound was that of my breathing as I labored. A short while later, the lid of the coffin appeared in the dirt, and I reached down to it. At first the lid wouldn't move, and it became clear that it hadn't been opened since the burial, which meant the groundskeeper must not have thought this poor soul's coffin was worth breaking into, and had left it undisturbed. I whispered an apology for what I was about to do, pried open the lid using the shovel, and began to slide it aside. The sickly, sweet smell of decay rose up from within the coffin. I screwed up my face in disgust and moved the lid all the way off. This body was not like the one that I had seen before, which had been freshly interred. This one had been underground for about 2 weeks, Its skin was ashen and split open in places. Maggots writhed inside the growing hollows where its eyes had been, and its face rippled and bulged because of the insects moving beneath, I knew. I swallowed down the bile that had risen into the back of my throat and tried to focus on the task at hand. The bell that I had come for was resting on the dead man's chest, which was confusing. There were no signs of rats, no signs that anything had disturbed the bell. So how had it rung? I was still wondering this when a beetle had emerged from between the lips of the corpse, followed by a sigh and then a word. "You," the dead man whispered. "You abandoned me. I gave the sign, I rang the bell, but you left me here to rot." With each word, more insects scurried out of its mouth, and as they left, the corpse's voice grew louder. "You abandoned me," it said and pointed an accusing finger at me. I was terrified, but somehow I managed to say, No, it was not me. It was the groundskeeper." It must have understood because it turned its sightless gaze away from me, and then it began to sit up. I scrambled backwards and just managed to get out of the way as the corpse climbed out of its grave. I grabbed the lantern and I held it up. By its light, I saw that the corpse held the bell in one of its hands. The flesh of its fingers had begun to fall away, and I could see the bone beneath as it began to ring the bell. The hideous toll cut through the night, and it was joined by the corpse crying out. "Vengeance," it screamed. "I demand vengeance." And then I heard a scraping sound behind me and span around, holding the lantern high. And I saw the mausoleum door slowly swinging open, and the figure of a man stepping out. He was barefoot. A new wave of fear rushed through me as I realized it was the corpse that the groundskeeper had just robbed. It began to walk towards the sound of the bell and the dead man calling for vengeance, and it was not alone. The corpse whose watch and ring and cigarette case the groundskeeper had stolen was dragging itself up out of the earth. To one side of it, a dozen graves or so along, a skeletal hand was reaching up. And in front of me, almost by my feet, a skull was emerging from the dirt, and I swear that I heard the word vengeance drift from its mouth. The only light beyond that of the lantern I held in my shaking hand came from the window of the gatehouse in the distance, and it was in this direction that the risen dead had turned and began to walk. Hypnotized by the horrors that I was witnessing, I followed. My legs gave way at one point and I fell, but I picked myself up and I continued in their wake. As I stumbled through the night, I was aware of more and more of the dead joining the grotesque procession, until finally they had reached the gatehouse. I could not see what happened then because there were so many of them, but I heard glass breaking and I heard a scream, and then silence settled over the necropolis. No bell rang, none called for vengeance. The dead had had their justice. I stood and watched as they returned to their graves, and they settled back to their rest. And I made a solemn vow that I would watch over them and make sure they were never disturbed again. And then I gathered up the remains of the groundskeeper and buried him in an unmarked grave. No one had cared for him, and my lie that he was probably lying drunk in a ditch somewhere was not questioned. And when he did not come back, I was given his position and the occupancy of the gatehouse. For 20 years and more, I worked hard and tended the necropolis and prepared its ground for many more burials, and I kept my vow. No burial place was ever desecrated, and each night as I waited for sleep to take me, I listened for a bell. But there was only silence. The dead remained peaceful in their graves.